Hello and welcome to episode number 12 of the AwesomeAlgo podcast. And today we have a rather interesting guest, Dan Goldman. He is a CEO of a platform called Ultrade, which I guess some could say is a white label launchpad for creating your own decentralized exchanges. Or in other words, you could say it's a DeFi infrastructure for different services on Algorand. So as a preface for the episode, I would like to outline that, as usual, I did my due diligence to research a bit on the platform, and today we would most likely just do an overview of Ultrade and the features it provides, and some backstory behind the creation of it, and of course, some interesting advices that Dan might give to aspiring software engineers and entrepreneurs who would like to get into blockchain development. And without further ado, I would like to give the stage to Dan. What I think would be great to start is a short overview of your academic background, or perhaps biography. How did you first get into blockchain and the crypto industry, just to set a bit of context for our listeners, and then we can do a dive towards discussions on Ultrade.
Sure. Well, great to be with you here, Al. I appreciate the invitation. Bit of background about me. I'm in my mid-40s now. I started with programming when I was like 10 years old. On back then it was in BASIC on an Atari 800 XL. Later on, I switched. For my bar mitzvah money, I bought my first PC. When I was 13, that was a 386, I think. And I started learning Pascal from books. By the time I was 18, still in high school, or 17, I can't remember exactly, I actually started one of the very first internet service providers in Israel, where I'm from originally. And at the time, we were actually running servers with Linux. I think it was like kernel 0.018 or something like that. I can't remember exactly, but started we couldn't even connect to the internet yet. So we actually, at the time, it was if you weren't an academic institution, in the mid-1994, you couldn't even get connected to the internet outside of, So we actually created our own Israeli internet with internet technologies, but without being connected to the world. And then about a year later, we were able to finally get lines to connect to the backbone and so on. So that's a very long time ago. Jumping forward a little bit, I got into the blockchain and crypto space in around 2012. And I think that's when I bought my first Bitcoin, if I'm not mistaken, or something like that. In 2014, I actually created a coin. This is before Ethereum. So it wasn't a token; it was an actual coin. So I've done all sorts of things in the space since then. I've built some trading technologies for institutional trading in 2017, 18, but the market was a little bit early for that, and also winter came in 2018 and was very difficult for us. So that's a little bit of a background. I have both the technology background and the business as well. I've always been kind of like in between those two, but business. I'm more on the business side and leading some of the tech side, but I don't usually do coding on a day-to-day basis.
I see. Thanks for the introduction, of course. Leaning a bit further towards the path to Ultrade, I'm sure it's also a pretty interesting story, but perhaps if you could also start by describing a little bit on what led you to start Ultrade, and how does it differ from other DeFi trading platforms available in the Algorand ecosystem? Or of course, you can bring up some other blockchain ecosystems here. And in other words, what would you say makes it special in that regard?
So in 2021, early 2021, I decided I wanted to kind of figure out, I wanted to get into the DeFi space. I thought that it was, very important. And I took maybe 6 months or so to kind of learn and understand what is happening in the market really, and where I think it's going, and problems, etc. And I realized that there were kind of there was a big issue that I saw, first and foremost, and that was that, most of the trading was still being done in custodial exchanges, centralized exchanges. And I'm not a fan of anything custodial. So, I looked at the market, and it seemed to me like there's some movement towards DeFi, towards non-custodial trading typically through AMMs such as Uniswap and similar. But on average, it was barely 10% of the total market volumes. So, globally, and that was certainly not enough. And I realized that there's a lack of tooling, proper trading tools in DeFi that is needed in order to move more trading volumes into DeFi. So AMMs are not enough. Most of the trading in the world is done through order books, and those were needed, and there weren't enough of them, and not advanced enough, not high quality enough. We needed a higher quality user experience in DeFi, and quality of tools that wasn't really available mostly. So that's what I set out to do early on with Ultrade. Now, as many startups go through, we also went through kind of like a learning experience. And as I kept building the product, which included, limit order book solutions, and planning on AMM, etc., we were planning a whole suite of applications, leverage perpetuals, lending and borrowing. But as I was building it, I realized that a little feature that I had in mind early on for white labeling it would actually be the pretty much most important thing that we could be doing. And the reason why is because, all of these exchanges out there are fighting with each other over users, right? So there are centralized exchanges and decentralized ones, and they all spend a lot of money on customer acquisition costs, right? The CAC for an exchange these days can be between $200 and $400, which is insane. That's unsustainable. And they're just, spending this money and fighting between themselves on user acquisition. To me, it was crazy. On the other hand, there are all of these thousands of brands out there, Web3 brands, that, they have an audience, so they're doing whatever they're doing, right? So it could be an NFT platform, it could be a GameFi company, or, all sorts of DeFi products. But at any point in time, their audience will need some kind of trading solution. It can be for generic trading, just trade something. It could be also specifically for the token of that brand, right? To buy it or to trade it. So what do the users do? And what does the brand do when that happens? The brand basically tells them, nah, not here. Please go away. Go to Binance, go to FTX, God rest its soul, go to, wherever, like Uniswap. which is crazy. Now, because you're using, the brand loses user retention and brand value, and the user has to go somewhere else. So they're engaged with the brand, but the brand can't provide them with these basic tools. Now, trading is no longer differentiated, right? So if you go to Binance or you go to FTX or you go to I don't know where, down the list of 400 exchanges, the product is pretty much the same, right? So
not sure if you can go to FTX anymore, though.
Well, yeah. So God rest its soul, right? But when you could, the product was the same, right? So it's still an order book exchange, and they're all pretty much the same. The liquidity is different, yes, but that's a different story. We can put it aside for a second, but from a technical perspective, the product is the same, and it's the same also with DEXs, right? So if you go to Uniswap or SushiSwap or whatever swap, it's all the same. So it's undifferentiated. It's generic. So if all of these trading venues are generic, then why does a brand have to send its users to those venues instead of providing value-add services in brand? And that's where our technology for trading and our business model suddenly clicked. Suddenly it made sense because we said, hey, we're going to build a trading tech infrastructure that enables any brand out there to instantly, immediately launch their own full DeFi trading platform with zero dev, zero code, zero resources. 5 minutes, boom, you're done. And still earn the majority of the trading fees from it. So not only can they provide the service, so retain the user, not send them somewhere else, provide more value to the user, but also generate a new revenue stream that they didn't have before. And that, to me, is, the holy grail. That's what thousands, maybe tens of thousands of Web3 brands today and in the years to come need and will need, as part of their business. So that's where we kind of shifted gears a little bit, shifted the focus of the company, and really dived more into, in that direction. And that's what Ultrade is. Ultrade is a DeFi as a service infrastructure that provides a full white label solution that anyone, any company, any person can literally launch a full DeFi trading platform like that. Boom, 5 minutes and you're done. And you don't even need to jumpstart your own liquidity, right? We mentioned the liquidity a moment ago, but that's a huge, mountain to climb. So we provide you a technical solution, but it's all shared liquidity. So everybody's trading with everybody. If you, as a podcast owner who has an audience, if you decided, hey, I want to provide a trading solution in my own brand to my users, you could do that in 5 minutes, but your users will be trading along with everybody else in the network. So it's the same liquidity pools, same order books, et cetera, et cetera. If you launched your own token within the network, yes, you would need to provide some initial liquidity. But for generic trading, you would not. Anything that's available within the network, including aggregation, by the way, in the AMM product, where we're working on aggregation as well to provide liquidity from other sources too. So it's not just based on the liquidity that we will have initially. You wouldn't be dependent on it. Your users will be able to get service through aggregation too. So that's, a little bit of a long overview of where, kind of like the road that led to creating Ultrade and what it is really.
Great introduction. I'll probably play sort of a role of a kind of a devil's advocate once we dive a bit deeper to the architecture part. But I think this certainly explains the premise a lot, and the term infrastructure in this case. I could see a lot of benefits for platforms that require trading capabilities, or certainly if you think about it, then it is the case in a lot of blockchain ecosystems where some platform contains a token or introduce some sort of utility, but essentially they just sort of kind of offload all responsibilities to a particular DEX, and then a user needs to do his own due diligence and look into that DEX, and then things can get complicated from there. And I would certainly agree that, yeah, from the perspective of even user experience, right, that breaks a lot of law, and you basically force your users to get embedded into a side product that you don't necessarily own or control. On the other hand, though, if we look into the blockchain ecosystem in terms of market caps, there's certainly Ethereum is still number 2. They were one of the first to introduce smart contracts, and probably the biggest ecosystem of decentralized applications at the moment. But the other thing that I'm interested in hearing a bit more is the choice for specifically picking Algorand as the base blockchain on which you are building Ultrade. So if we can dive into it, how does Ultrade use Algorand blockchain, and how does it give Ultrade advantages in that regard, and if there are any prominent L1 capabilities that Algorand provides that Ultrade utilizes, would be interested for you to mention, those particular capabilities.
Sure. So the choice of Algorand was, I was looking at the time at, what to build and where to build it, right? And, I looked at Solana. I knew Algorand for quite a while. I actually met Silvio Micali briefly in 2017 in New York. He was presenting it and presenting the concept of Algorand. It wasn't built at the time, but and I spoke with him about it, and I thought that it was very, very cutting edge compared to anything else that I'd seen. So until that point, and to me, the technology made a lot of sense. Security, scalability, it all comes together in a way that makes sense. And it had, even when I got started on it, it already had a very good track record in terms of stability. And that's opposed to Solana, for example, which I looked into as well, which was a much bigger ecosystem in terms of users and value, and et cetera. But it wasn't stable, and that gave me pause. I didn't feel comfortable building on it because of it. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe it's hard to say exactly, right? But we see still, that it's unstable. So while it may get better, and probably is getting better over time, I felt like it wasn't the right choice for us. And Algorand was and still is, a relatively small chain in terms of users, et cetera, and projects. But the combination of the technology and stability, and ease of development, costs of transactions, it all adds up into a compelling value proposition. Now, with that said, it is a small ecosystem. I think it will grow over time, but we planned to begin with. The plan was to be a multi-chain solution. So even though we started with Algorand, we are about to go to mainnet in the next month or so, roughly around end of February, maybe a little shortly after that, on Algorand. But next after that, the plan is to expand with EVM support. And once we have EVM, that's going to be Ethereum, Polygon, Binance Smart Chain, Arbitrum, maybe AVAX, et cetera, et cetera. So that's planned for sometime in Q2. Once we do that, I expect the reach of the platform to be drastically, it's more than more than an order, probably 2 orders of magnitude bigger in terms of our, ability to reach potential customers as a B2B platform. So that's kind of, where we started and why we started there, and where we're trying to go, in the near future. I think there was another part to your question, a bit more.
Yeah,
maybe
this was in regards to L1 capabilities that Algorand provides out of the box. Just curious to hear, if there's any prominent features that you explicitly utilize. I suppose, of course, you rely on the Algorand stateful, perhaps stateless smart contracts in this regard as well. But if you could just give a brief overview of things
we use full stateful, apps, Algorand applications. I would say, it's kind of like, to me, it's all very basic stuff, right? I mean, the inner transactions, there are a lot of capabilities there, kind of like that I would consider as basic, even though it took time for them to arrive. But once they did, when we got started, most of them already kind of came in, and so we already started using them, kind of like as what I would consider to be kind of basic stuff. So inner transactions. Now we're even using the relatively new feature of box storage. What else? I mean, I can't say that there's any particular thing that is, very differentiated, maybe compared to other chains, right? So I mean, apps in Algorand, applications act very like you would expect from a very typical program in certain ways, right? The storage is a little bit more complex with, depending on how you want to store it. That's still a little bit tricky, but ultimately it's relatively simple if you compare it, for example, to EVM and other chains. I think it's pretty straightforward and simple to develop on it, which I like. It's very predictable, very easy to understand the code and what it's doing and why it's doing what it's doing. I mean, if you have any specific questions,
maybe just out of curiosity, then in this case, if you could just recap the year in which you started on Ultrade, because over the past couple of years, I would say the amount of tooling in the ecosystem has experienced a pretty significant growth. Even comparing, let's say, making a D app today and making the app a year ago is a completely different experience.
I would say it is. I would say I started Ultrade in kind of around September of 2021.
I see. Okay.
But it took a while to before we actually started coding. So I would say coding started only in early, maybe early 2022 or late 2021, I guess. Until then it was a lot, finding the people, raising some capital, getting some research done, figuring out the initial product before you start actually coding. So by that time, there were some significant advancements, in the AVM, and that was definitely very helpful to not, quote unquote, waste time and resources on, using tools that prior to that were a little bit too, cumbersome, and you kind of needed to reach from A to B through C and D sometimes, which wasn't ideal, to say the least.
Additionally, if I may ask, what is the stack of preference for smart contract development in this
It's
case?
just
Because
PyTeal.
it's just PyTeal. Okay, yeah, I see. A lot
I
of
like PyTeal in general. There are other options in the market, but at the time, for example, those like Reach, for example, at the time, Reach had some, more limitations as well, and and we ended up just saying, hey, PyTeal makes sense to us, and that's what we're working with.
I see. So let's dive a bit deeper into particular features that Ultrade provides out of the box, and there will be some follow-up questions in that particular section. But let's assume we have a use case for a DApp creator or DApp owner, and he goes on Ultrade basically to create his own DEX for his service. So what sort of features can he expect out of the box by just deploying his own version of the DEX?
So, as a B2B white label partner or client, there's an admin panel essentially. So once you have an account with us, you have an admin panel that lets you launch the whole thing, customize and launch your entire DeFi platform. So you can define all of your brand parameters, from your name to your logo to your to URL that will load the system, to any color customizations of the entire UI, et cetera, what trading pairs you want to list out of everything that's currently available. You can create new pairs if you want to, or for your own assets or whatever else. And, you can define anything from geo-blocking, to decide where you want to provide service and where you want to avoid for, compliance reasons. What else? Yeah, it's really a fairly customizable and will be even more so over time solution that is just all in the interface. You don't need to write a single line of code, not CSS, nothing. Once you do, you get an embed code that you simply put into your website, your app, whatever it is, and that's it. You're done. So it's literally in 5 minutes you can get the whole thing. Once you do, we currently have 2 products built on top of it out of 4 that we're planning. Those 2 products are the limit order book spot exchange, spot DEX, and the AMM. So the AMM everybody knows, right? It's like a Uniswap, etc. So you have a full-blown AMM. People can create pools, add liquidity to the pools, and swap. And this AMM also does 2 more things. It aggregates other AMMs in the Algorand ecosystem, and it also takes liquidity from the order book. So it's what we call the HAMM, HAAMM, hybrid aggregating AMM. And providing liquidity also from the order book enables more liquidity, less slippage. It will facilitate also limit orders, etc. And then, so the full order book DEX provides a limit orders, market orders, etc. And it's it's basically like an order book DEX you would order book exchange you would find in a centralized exchange, right? So those are the core products that you would get from from the platform that you can literally launch in about 5 minutes.
I see. And what about things like, say, KYC? And are there any particular sort of legal implications in that regard? Like, are you requiring, for example, that the creator of a DEX needs to be a representative of a registered company or some LLC, or it's essentially Web3. You rely on the wallet authentication and essentially offloading the implications of using the instance created through Ultrade to the company that is, or the individual that is managing it.
Yeah, no, it's I mean, right now it's still going to be in closed beta, so it'll be permissioned, etc. But the plan over time is to make it as permissionless as we can, and it's a Web3 product. Everybody can run it if they want to. KYC and AML, for the end user, we do plan on having that as a solution later on, with what we call a compliance layer. So, we still need to develop it. It's slated for later in this year, but the compliance layer would enable a white label partner to say, hey, I only want to provide compliant, trading. It'll work through a DAD. So, we will need to integrate DAD solutions and enable the system to know if the user is KYC'd or not, and if they are, they can trade in a permissioned environment versus the unpermissioned.
I see.
So it's part of the plan, but it's not something that we are enforcing. We are providing an infrastructure for the partners to use as they see fit.
Yeah, that certainly makes sense. To continue on the architecture, I suppose the solution is comprised from a set of, I would say, backend centralized components, I suppose, to optimize for the experience, and then I would imagine that you also have a Web3 layer in this regard, so some sort of set of templates, I suppose, for the smart contracts that the creator would be deploying whenever he creates the new instance. But could you also just briefly describe the overall higher level architecture of the system?
Sure. So different components work differently, right? So some of it has a backend, some of it is smart contracts only, or it's always some combination, right? Yeah. Because the front end needs some backend to function, but the AMM is mostly smart contracts. The order book requires some backend because there are certain limitations to what you can do with the smart contract. And, for example, for the actual matching engine, right now it's not feasible to achieve on-chain with Algorand. By the by, when we go to other chains, depending which one, some chains might support it. Solana, for example, you could do it, but again, there are some other considerations with Solana that may not make it ideal. So it just depends on the product. So it's a combination of those components.
I see. And looking at the prominent DeFi platforms in Algorand, and I'm sure this is the case for a lot of DeFi systems in Ethereum as well, there's often a case when a certain chunk of the platform or entire platform is available under some sort of either public or open source license. And it's often the case where, for example, the contracts itself are open source with a set of supplied references to the security audits that have been performed. And I suppose in case of Ultrade, security audits would be a very high sort of priority or a thing to keep in mind, because in this particular case, if we assume a set of different platforms and users onboarding into a white label solution like that, and that is also sharing the same liquidity, there needs to be an extremely high guarantee of compliance and security in that regard, right? Because in some sense, it could be kind of like an entry point for some malicious people to try to attack it. And of course, it's a great choice to pick Algorand in this regard as well. I think certainly things like denial of service attacks or things that are usually exploited by systems that are not well decentralized could be utilized. But yeah, how do you usually approach security and compliance in regards to Ultrade contracts, and are those available open source?
So it's not open. Well, the contracts are open source once they go live on mainnet. You know, anybody can see code, but but we before going to mainnet, we will go through an audit. We haven't finished the work yet, so it's not done, but that's part of the plan for the next month and a half or so. To finish an audit and before going to mainnet. And the code, once we are on mainnet, anybody can go and see the actual contract codes as well.
I see. Additionally, as part of this question on the architecture, could you mention any interesting challenges that were faced during development? Perhaps, some very tricky things in regards to the infrastructure, or some problems or nuances in regards to testing methodologies. I could imagine if you started in 2021, then testing or end-to-end testing of contracts using PyTeal would have been a bit tricky, right? Because there was a lot of things not available back then in regards to spinning up Sandbox in some sort of Docker Compose environment or things like that.
Well, those existed already. We didn't have an issue with that. Testing smart contract is never easy in general, but so it's a little bit more of a manual process usually. It requires some code, and then kind of like sending transactions and seeing what happened and trying to figure out where the issues were and so on. It's not as straightforward as you would hope. Some of the complexities, I would say, we were looking to, for example, to do some of the the matching engine, etc. We were looking to do it on chain, but it was just not, we did our best to do that, but it's just not feasible in the current iteration. Even with box storage, based on certain limitations, what you can and cannot do, it's just not feasible. There are some complexities in choosing if you need, a connection between the backend and the smart contracts, you needed the right tools to kind of get the information from the chain, from the logs into your backend, and took us a while to find the right tools for that and kind of put them together, improve them a little bit to do what we needed. So there's the infrastructure, I would say, is usually where it takes a lot of kind of putting together, making sure that you're getting the information, and passing it through your backend the right way, and then getting back to the chain. There's a lot of timing considerations, because nothing is instant, right? I mean, a block takes, now it's 3.8 seconds, so there's kind of like, you have to figure out the flow depending on what you're doing, right? I mean, the order book is much more complicated than an AMM, right? So there are some complexities around that, but if you have the right people and you know what you're doing, it's doable. It's just have to be very detail oriented, I would say.
I see. And maybe as a last question in regards to things touching on the architecture, it's often a topic for debate whenever there is a DApp platform that provides some sort of service that explicitly relies on stateful contracts. And the topic of concern is usually who is supposed to be the manager of the contract, who has the rights to, tweak, upgrade the contract, change certain functionality, things like that. And some platforms, for example, the NFD domains provide some sort of, I would say, a balanced approach in that regard, where they do not force you to upgrade the contracts. They cannot update your contract on your behalf, but they give you a choice, basically. So here's the new version. We added this, this, and this. If you like it, please upgrade the contract, and you get access to this. If you don't, you can stay on the current version. I'm curious, how's it managed on the side of Ultrade? So let's say a user created a new DEX, he deploys a set of contracts to manage the order book, manage the AMM. But what set of control does the Ultrade manager accounts have over his deployed instance?
So, in general, once you deployed, mostly there's not much that you can change. If there will be new versions, it may require, maybe early on, in early days of the mainnet, maybe there will be some upgradability, to avoid situations where there's, major issues with code or anything like that. But as a whole, I would say you want to avoid upgrades once things are stable, and just transition into new versions instead. So if there's a AMM application, or a pool application or whatever, once you want to upgrade to a new code version, it's better to just create a new a V2, V3, whatever it is, and migrate the users to those. And that migration is typically voluntary. At some point you might say, hey, we are sunsetting V1, and don't stay there, because we're not going to support it in the front end anymore. But that's typically a process that takes a few months or whatever it is. We are, that's where I want to go. But I will say, early on, you want to have some ability to make sure that code is stable enough to before you go there. But that should be a short period of time, not a long one.
I see. Yeah, I guess this is just mostly comes from the position on, because I think in regards to Algorand ecosystem, I'm not sure if there is some sort of either best practice or a standardized approach for DEX providers or white label DEX providers to handle migrations of contracts, because everything requires a manual transaction by the user. If you look, for example, at the incident in early 2022 when there was a hack in TinyMan V1, it was, I could imagine the stress that the guys had getting this during winter holidays, and then essentially they had to force everyone who provided liquidity to go to their platform and sign manual transactions and basically sign off that thing. That's I suppose one of the ways to deal with it, and certainly this is also coming from the limitation of the smart contracts as a technology. In general, it's just a different paradigm that you need to get used to, of course. But yeah, I was just curious if there was some efforts to look if there is any proposals or ways to standardize some sort of methodology on how to deal with upgrades. But
it's certainly not standardized in the industry. I think a lot of common sense needs to be put in place. Just for example, you could provide a switch that just disables everything except for withdrawals. right? In terms of an AMM, just for example, right? So you could withdraw your liquidity, and assuming that if you had a bug, like whatever TinyMan had, so maybe you could have just disabled all functionality except for taking out your liquidity, and then they could deploy a new version with a fixed version where you could put your liquidity back if you so wished. So there are different ways to manage such situations or prepare for them in advance in event of, but there aren't any standards. There aren't any, we're going to apply as much common sense as we can, to mitigate potential issues. But, TinyMan are real people, not scammers, so are we, real people, so you need to, so in an early version of any company, any product, etc., you could either say, hey, we are going to employ zero trust, right? None whatsoever. But if there are issues, then there are issues. And we have to migrate completely. There's no way to mitigate them. Or you could say, we're going to incorporate some level of trust, some mechanisms early on to enable the company to, mitigate problems that may arise. And maybe that's a process that over time reduces the trust more and more until, everything is stable enough so that there's no need for such measures. We're still figuring it out, and trying to apply common sense that we think will provide the most balanced approach that protects the users, enables us to be there in the case of a problem, and move forward.
Yeah, certainly makes sense. Like the reason why I mentioned it is that folks at Algorand are pretty open towards creators and founders in the community to propose different arcs, which is, I'm sure you're familiar with this. It's sort of like an RFC for different conventions and standards in the Algorand ecosystem. So perhaps if you guys at Ultrade will come up with some interesting and generalist approach towards it, I could also imagine turning this into an arc of some sort and discussing it with other folks and basically.
Perhaps our focus is on.
Yeah, for sure.
The platform. If this is a byproduct of it, great, but it's not a focus for us right now.
For sure. It's just one of those, I guess. Nice to have things. But all right. So I think we had a pretty good overview of the premise. I certainly haven't heard of anything similar in Algorand ecosystem. I'm not sure about Ethereum, but certainly at Algorand, yeah.
As far as we know, we are a world first. Now, there are some, comparables in some ways, right? There's different ways to do anything, but we don't know of anything that is really similar to what we do, the way we do it. No.
And to continue on the topic of Ultrade, how do you see Ultrade and overall broader DeFi space evolving in the future? And perhaps you could also mention some interesting things on the roadmap that users should expect for this year.
Well, in terms of the roadmap, I mentioned earlier, we're planning to go into EVM. That would be a huge deal for us. The compliance layer, probably late in the year, but that I think would be a big deal too. We do want to add, we plan to add leverage perpetuals and lending and borrowing earlier on, but there was a lot to do and we just didn't get to it yet. Will we get to it this year? I hope so. And so I would say those are kind of the main things to expect sometime this year. In terms of where the space is going, I think there's going to need to be a lot of consolidation in trading, at least. It just doesn't make sense that there are all of these companies that try to build again and again and again the same thing and fight over the users. It just doesn't make sense. Every Web3 brand should have its own trading solution, but they shouldn't be building it. It should be a value-add solution that they can provide out of the box, as a ready-made solution, and that's why we're building what we're building. Ultrade is designed to bring this kind of disruption into the market, and I think we're going to see that happening. And there might be others who try to do the same, simply because the business model of all of these exchanges, trying to build something of their own and then going after the users, it's unsustainable. It just doesn't make sense. It's, kind of creating silos of liquidity. So then they have to do aggregation, but then they have to attract the user. So any way you look at it, it's not doing the users any favors. It's not doing those companies any favors. It's just a broken market, in my view, and I think it's going to change, and we're leading the charge.
I guess in some sense it's also creating silos even within the blockchain development space. Over the past many years, I suppose, it became a very sort of specific domain within blockchain development where people are putting a lot of focus just into DeFi. And I certainly can agree that there's a lot of sort of reinvention and building the same bicycles over and over again. And on an example of Ultrade and other prominent platforms being built on Algorand, I think it's very important that there is focus on providing infrastructure, providing utility, providing building blocks for other creators and aspiring developers to build on top of it. Why would you want to, for example, if you look into the case of NFD domains, once again, I just really like the premise that they have that why would you want to deal with, let's say, reverse lookups of the addresses, right? If there is already a service with which you can interact on the level of IVM, on the level of REST APIs, on the level of JS SDKs and things like that, that already exist, and you can build entire ecosystems on top of it. So I could certainly imagine a lot of interesting use cases arising when there is this sort of need for providing, liquidity, providing DEXs and things like that is alleviated when there is already a provider. And in the Web2 space, I guess you could look at this as an example with massive cloud providers, right? There is a lot of infrastructures being built. No one is running their own software on their own services these days. Of course, there are people who still do that, but we pretty much transitioned into a different space. But I could.
Yeah, everything that is, generic, anything that is, today, most people don't go and build a website with, straight up HTML, right? They use some kind of platform for it. They don't, you go to Shopify, you don't build your own custom, web store. You go to Shopify or some similar solution. If you want to sell a product, you typically go and sell it on Amazon. So SaaS in general is a good approach to many things, and that's what DaaS is, DeFi as a service, right? We didn't invent the wheel in that regard, right? We looked at what works and makes sense in Web 2 and what are the problems in Web 3, and we said, this is a model that will solve a certain situation in Web 3 with trading, where it's a generic service, everybody needs it. practically every single Web3 user needs trading services at any point in time. So why would they have to go to a bespoke, venue and try to choose out of hundreds of them when they all do the same thing, instead of getting that as a value add service from a brand they are already interacting with? It's kind of like in the US, for example, you would find many times, for example, a bank branch inside a supermarket. So, you don't have to go specifically to the bank somewhere, you're just in the supermarket, you're doing your stuff. Oh, I need a bank. Okay, here it is right there. Or, on the other hand, or when you go to all these, brands, websites, and they say, hey, here's our brand of Visa debit card or Visa credit card, right? So it's a branded credit card, but they are not the supplier of it. They are just a branded version of it. For the user, sometimes it makes sense. They need it, they get an offer, they apply, but it's a white label solution, right? Of sort, or not exactly white label, but similar. So all of these things work in different ways, and they provide a solution that is needed. And this is what we're doing with Ultrade in Web3 in DeFi.
And before we transition to the final question of the episode, and this is something that I usually ask pretty much all guests I had so far, just wanted to highlight one additional thing. You mentioned the plans that you guys are having for the expansion to other chains, particularly AVM, right? And there's a lot of things built on top of AVM that will become available to you once you do this expansion as well. Have you heard of Subquery?
Subquery?
Yeah.
I don't believe so.
Just wanted to, mention it because I think you guys might find this useful for your use case. They have I would say, pretty interesting business model as well. What they do is they provide an infrastructure layer for deploying your own custom blockchain indexers that are not tied to individual blockchain. In other words, you could essentially have your own indexer that can deal with, let's say, aggregation of certain transactions, or can aid and simplify interactions with, of course, Algorand indexers is generic, right? The set of capabilities it provides out of the box is enough to pretty much extract any transaction you want, but it's not tailored towards your own individual application in this case. So a pretty interesting business model, and they also allow you to then deploy this as an API on their network, and also get additional fees for the usage of that API. You can also provide it as an external service. But yeah, just wanted to mention it. It's a startup from New Zealand. They support at least 5 or 6 chains already at the moment. And I had a member from their team on the podcast earlier last year. So yeah, if you need a custom indexer, just wanted to let you know that there are tools that allow you to simplify this process a lot as well.
Cool. All right. Well,
and so to move on to the final question, what advice would you give to aspiring software engineers and entrepreneurs who would want to try their hands on blockchain development? Doesn't necessarily need to be Algorand, talking just as an entry point to Web3 space in general.
Well, the simplest advice is to just do it. I mean, if you're looking to get into the space, you've never touched it before, you need to start playing around with it. Just do stuff. Now, there are different ways to do that. You can just create things for yourself, in your spare time while you're still working for Google or Microsoft. Or you could, if you have the luxury to not have to work right now and you just want to dive into something, then again, just dive into it, write your own, figure out what chains interest you and why. Do you want to build something for yourself or go work for someone, for some company? Either way, you need some experience. So build stuff. It is complicated, but not that complicated. There are different aspects to it that with higher levels of complication versus lower levels. Algorand, for example, represents relatively a lower level of complication versus Ethereum, I would say. And again, different aspects of it are, less complex. If you're starting with stuff that relates to encryption and, the math aspect of it, stuff like that, it's a separate skill set that you would need and is not easy to learn. But other aspects of it are easier and maybe more, generic or a skill set that's more prevalent in the market. So it really depends, but go for it, do it. I mean, hell, go to a project and say, hey, I'm interested in participating, helping. I'll take tokens instead of a salary. Just tell me what to do and I'll try to figure it out. That's one way to do it. Hey, if people came to me and said that, because I wouldn't be able to put them on salary right now if they don't have a lot of skills already, but if they wanted to, kind of learn as they go and they want to assist and participate, sure, we could utilize them and they could get the experience. That unless you have a more specific subset of for that question, that's the first thing that comes to mind as an advice on how to get into it.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, that's certainly, I'd say, the most concise and pragmatic answer I got on this question so far. If you're into it, if you feel inspired or interested by technology, the best way to learn it is just to apply things practically and build simple hello world and sort of go from there. At the end of the day, for me, blockchain is very similar to the term deep learning, which is sort of a glorified term for something that has been around in computer science for many years, but you got to come up with new trendy terms in the industry to sell the tech from time to time. But if you think about it, blockchain is a glorified term for very sophisticated decentralized systems that focus on a very specific goal to accomplish in this regard.
Sure.
And with that, I think we had a pretty good overview of Ultrade. I will include additional information and references on how folks can try out testnet. To recap what Dan already mentioned, Ultrade is already available for people to try it out. There is a testnet version, and there's a testnet faucet that allows you to get some tokens to play with the platform. And once again, Dan, thanks a lot for coming to the podcast. I'm looking forward to see how you guys are going to go ahead this year, and all the best with the mainnet launch. I know how complicated security compliance could be especially for things like smart contracts, but I think it's certainly an interesting and unique premise, and wish you guys all the best with the launch.
Thanks, man. I appreciate it. Thank you very much for taking the time for this conversation. And we'll be glad to come back and share some, news, etc., and what's going on. And hey, if you want to have your own brand of DeFi at some point, come talk with us. Whip up your own brand in 5 minutes, and have some fun with it.
Sounds good.
Awesome. Thanks, man.